Hello, my name is Oliver Pickard and welcome to my workshop. Now, believe it or not, Pandora, my little mini supercar, and the Lamborghini Miura share a lot in common. Stop laughing, it's true. Allow me to explain. You see, the GTM and the Miura were both inspired by the Mini. That's why the Lamborghini Miura's engine is transverse and the gearbox oil and the engine oil is the same oil, just like a Mini. And the floor pans aren't dissimilar either. But there's a couple of inherent problems with the Miura that the GTM also shares. You see, that engine configuration with the engine and gearbox together and the oil being shared between the two means that the weight of the engine is right on the rear axle line. And at the front, the fuel tank is out here over the front axle line. Meaning that as the car drives along and the fuel tank empties, the front of the car gets lighter and lighter and lighter. So it makes it really hard to get the spring rate right on the front of the car. I've talked about this in previous videos, but that's why it happens. Just like the Miura, when the fuel tank starts to go low, the front end goes light. And that's a bit of an issue. Now, I've sorted that out at the rear because we've moved the engine from here over the rear axle line forward by using the K-Series engine, and it's now much lower. It used to sit, the original Mini engine would sit up here and the K-Series sits down here. So Pandora actually has a much lower centre of gravity than an original GTM, and the engine is actually much further forward, where the crank would have been here and it's actually over here. So we've moved everything forward. That stops the problem at the rear, but we haven't stopped the problem at the front just yet. But today I'm going to go through, just like we did with the rear suspension, what I'm using for the front suspension and why, and how I'm going to prevent the same problem as the Miura and as the original GTM in Pandora. As well as making room for me, because I'm 6'6", and everybody told me when I first bought Pandora that I wouldn't be able to fit in it. And I knew I wouldn't be able to fit in it when I bought the car, which is why I bought the car without even sitting in it. I just had a look at the condition and I said to the guy, how much? Because I knew I didn't fit, so I knew there was no point in trying. So, how am I going to sort out the inherent dynamic problems of the GTM? By the way, the GTM and the Miura are two of my favourite cars ever made. What can I say? It matches my suit. Perfect. I don't much go in for supercars, but I do love the Miura. And this is part of the character of the GTM and the Miura. But with the Miura, it evolved and it became the Miura Jota, and then the Miura Jota SV, and then the Miura Jota SVR. One of which I saw actually Lamborghini's Jota this time last year in Paris. Definitely not design purity and quite as messed with as a Miura can possibly be, but incredibly pretty. And with the Jota, they fixed the problems, they evolved the car and they made it better, and that's just what I want to do for Pandora. Now, I've moved the engine forward in the car. I've also moved me forward in the car, which has moved all the weight forward and more central and lower in the car to give it better balance. Now, at the front of the GTM, the original front end has a mini front subframe that fits like this, and here is the front subframe mounted up in the exact same way it is in a Mini. And we have some Mark 1 Mini Cooper S disc brakes, some poly bushes, but we also have some welded suspension arms. Welded suspension arms are legal in some places, not legal in other places. Personally, I'm not a fan of them. When the Japanese make something illegal, it's usually for a really good reason. The steering rack sits up against here, and there's a big gap between the floor and the steering rack. And that's a big problem for me, because I'm 2 meters tall, I'm 6'6" in Imperial. And not only that, this hole is right between the pedals, and I have really big feet. So I can't left foot brake, and there's a really annoying shaft that means that my accelerator foot rubs on the it rubs on the steering shaft, and that's a big issue. It rubs on my steering column basically, and I need room for my feet, and there's not a lot of room to play with. The other issue is that the fuel tank sits where the original Mini engine sits, and that's right over that front axle line, as I previously said. Now, petrol weighs, and I've got it written on the wall so that I don't forget it, it weighs 0.7489 kilos per litre, right? And the original GTM fuel tank, which I've got here, there, throwing all the stuff, this fuel tank, that sits right over that front axle line, holds 30 litres. So it weighs 24.467 kilos when it's full. But when it's empty, it weighs nothing. So the front of a GTM has a dynamic weight that it gains and loses of nearly 26.5 kilos. And that's a huge problem for me, because I have a 2 litre engine, which means I'd quite like a fuel tank that's 50 litres, not just 30 litres, which is a dynamic weight of 37.445 kilos. So the front end of this car will gain and lose. Okay, you're not going to drain your fuel tank right to the bottom, but it's safe to say that you're going to gain and lose 34.5 kilos. And that's right over the front axle line. This is the same problem that the Mura has. So how am I going to solve that problem? Well, it involves the front suspension. And here I have the incredibly heavy Mini upright. And as you can see, the steering arm is on the top and it goes rearward. So this is the left side steering arm, or what would be the driver's side in a right-hand drive car. So I suppose it's the right-hand steering arm, like that. And that poses a problem, because the steering rack has to be there for this suspension. But what if it doesn't? What if I get my steering rack and move it over here? I move my fuel tank back. That solves my problem. But of course, my steering arm is still over here. So there's no way to connect my steering arm to my steering rack. And on top of that, I really want to convert this car to left-hand drive. So I have a cunning plan. This is the upright from the world's most popular sports car, the Mazda MX-5. And the clever thing about the Mazda MX-5 is the steering arm is on the front. So that is a right-hand steering arm from an NX5, and that is a right-hand steering arm from a Mini. And as you can see, the steering arm's at the top and runs rearward here, and it's on the bottom and runs forward here. This is also incredibly heavy, and it's designed for a front-wheel drive car. Obviously, it's from a Mini. The problem with that is, as well, that knuckle is designed to go around a CV boot. It's designed to go around a front-wheel drive shaft. And I really wanted something that was for an actual rear-wheel drive car, not using front-wheel drive components on the front of a mid-engine car, because that's a bit like a compromise to me. So this fits the bill perfectly, and it solves our problem. And now the steering rack's out of the way, we can move the fuel tank back. So our dynamic load of 24.467 kilos is now behind the front axle line. It is behind the centre point of the front wheels. Not only that, because there's no steering rack here, I can actually have some leg room. Great stuff! But we've created another problem for us, because this steering rack was designed to be behind the upright. So if I turn right, so turning right, turning right, turning right, turning right, because the rack is now in front of the upright, that would turn this way. So turning right would make us turn left. So left is right, right is left. It's the worst problem you could possibly have. Except for the fact that I want to make this car left-hand drive. So we take our original Mini steering rack, our original GTM steering rack, and flip it over. And now, what happens is, we turn right, like that. Lo and behold, the car turns right. It's like magic. Now, let me show you how all of this is going to fit in the front of Pandora. Now, please bear in mind that many of the things I'm going to show you are not the final components that are going in here. It is just to show you. It's just a demonstration. Proof of concept, as it were. Just to show you how it all fits together. So, the first thing we need is our fuel tank. Now, I've placed a piece of wood on this blue pallet. The end of the blue pallet is precisely the end of the car. So anything that fits within the blue pallet easily fits within the front of Pandora. The next thing we need is our steering rack and our flipped Mini steering rack. It goes in here. We're all turned to one side because of the previous demonstration. So that goes in like that. Now we need some suspension, and you'll notice we're now on what will be the driver's side of the car, so we need some driver's side suspension. A front upright with a lower arm on it. Clap it down. Now we grab our upper wishbone. Now you'll notice these wishbones are much longer than the standard Mini wishbones, which means that we have a really good amount of suspension travel length, which is great news. And all of this stuff is available with polyurethane bushes of varying grades. So I can use super soft poly bushes, I can use super hard poly bushes, whatever I may need, which is good. It's always good to have options. And of course, being the world's most popular sports car, it's widely available. That being said, these uprights were an absolute pain to find because apparently nobody's crashed an MX-5 in a while. Not in France anyway. So. Stay. 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 Come on. Stay. Stay where I put you. Stay. Yes. I have practiced this previously. 9 times out of 10, that wishbone does not want to stay where I put it. So we'll connect our steering rack. Now there's a slight problem with using this steering rack with an MX-5 suspension, and that is that it's an imperial rack and a metric suspension. So the ball joint is obviously different. Not only that, the threads on the rack themselves are imperial threads. Fortunately, there is a bump steer corrector available that goes from imperial to metric. I can actually make one as well. But what that will allow me to do is use a Mazda factory roll center correction ball joint, which is a longer ball joint which Mazda make and you can just buy from a dealership or online or whatever. And in their infinite wisdom, they've already made the parts for me, which is nice of them. Thank you, Mazda. And that will then connect to the adapter. And I'm not usually a fan of adapters, but there are many people who use these as the little adapters as a bump steer corrector. So it works as both an adapter and a bump steer corrector. And many people put them on cars that are metric on both sides. So it will not just be an adapter, it's a valuable tool in both extending the rack and helping us to dial out any bump steer. So that's great news. So pop that on there like that. So it's not, the rack isn't long enough and it's imperial, but we'll sort that out when the time comes. You stay. 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 Yes! Haha! That's the best it's ever worked. Okay, so the next thing that I need is my radiator. But I need a couple of pieces of wood first. I need that bit, and I need this bit. And obviously I've put the fuel tank on a piece of wood because the last thing that you want is your fuel tank rubbing on the floor when you go over bumps or hitting anything or anything like that. You want it lifted up out of the way. Unfortunately, my heater has this handy notch built in. So that's cool. Right, we need a radiator. This is a prime example of parts that are not returning to this car. This is the Austin Allegro radiator that this car originally used. And it's a piece of rubbish, much like many Austin Allegros. But it will do for a mock-up. And obviously I'll be using a much larger radiator than this because we now have 250 horsepower. So that goes against that. Use this. Stay. That goes on there like that, and this stops it moving. Like that. Right. Now, as I previously mentioned, the edge of this pallet is the edge of the car, but I've put the piece of wood in to allow us to use a bigger radiator in future. But like I said, I'm just showing you what it will look like. As I've mentioned previously on this channel, you design a car from its tyres inward, and the reason you do that is because you have very restricted availability as far as tyres go, especially depending on where you live and that kind of thing. So you design the tyres that you get the biggest ones you can basically, and then you get your wheels for your tyres, and then you design your suspension for your wheels and tyres, and then you design your chassis for your suspension points. You don't start with a chassis and then build out. It's the wrong way to do it. You're putting the cart before the horse. And why am I talking about that now? Well, we have a 250 brake horsepower 2-litre Honda engine in the back. And we first did the rear suspension, and I showed you what I was using for the rear suspension because the rear suspension controls how wide the car is. Now, I decided to use, instead of using the Integra shafts that would have been fitted to this engine, because this engine is from a DC5 Integra Type R, instead of using Integra shafts, which are quite long, I decided to use Honda Civic EP3 Type R drive shafts, early 2000s Honda Civic drive shafts, and the reason is they're shorter. which makes the car much more narrow. The good news about that is that Pandora will be narrower than a Lotus Elise. Yay, that's fantastic news. The problem with that is we still have really big tyres, really wide tyres anyway. And the studs that are on the original GTM fuel tank for holding a spare tyre are a really good idea. And I'd really like to be able to fit a spare tyre, full-size spare tyre in the front of Pandora. Unfortunately, because of the width of tyres necessary, it's just not doable. And I really want to drive a long way in Pandora. So I've chosen a tyre that's massively available all over the world, so that if I ever have a problem, I can actually just order them online and have them arrive at my doorstep. But a can of fix-a-flat is not going to cut it. I do need a spare tyre, and that's why I'm going to use one of these. This is what the Americans call a donut. It's a space saver spare, and I've borrowed this one from a Renault Megane just for this demonstration. But that fits just there. It doesn't really fit because my piece of wood is incorrectly calibrated. But, oh, come on, stay. If I just hold that there, you can see that quite handily that fits beautifully well within the bonnet. And this is a 14-inch space saver spare, so I have plenty of space for a space saver wheel. That's great news. It means I can carry a proper spare tyre, so that if I am in some far-flung corner of Europe or anywhere and have a problem, I can put my space saver spare straight on and drive to the nearest town, whatever, go to a tyre shop, get some tyres, and I'm off. That's the good news. So it's all about having Pandora usable, because there's no point just having a kind of fix-a-flat that sometimes fixes a tyre. Because I really plan on driving a long way in this car, like I say, and the last thing that I want is to be in a place where I have to wait half a day for a recovery truck to come and save me, because I've built the car wrong, and it won't. And I need to be serviceable, is my point. That's why I want to use the MX-5 suspension, because MX-5s are a classic car now. MX-5s are a much loved car now, and there are massive MX-5 specialists. So even in 20 years time, I will still be able to get MX-5 parts, because they are increasing in value. People are very precious now about their MX-5s. There are people restoring MX-5s, which is great stuff. All that means that in the future I will be able to get bushes, I will still be able to get ball joints, and I won't have any problems with that. It future-proofs the car. That's the reason I'm using it. And like I said, they've made millions of them, so that's great news. So that's all lovely. My only one slight issue is this bush here. And it's not a problem because of what I'm about to tell you. If I climb in Pandora, there we go. Now bear in mind, I'm currently wearing clogs, which make my legs a little bit longer than they usually are. I won't be driving Pandora in clogs, I promise. But handily, that bush is just forward of where my floor will be. It is only just, but it is just. And I have spec'd a floor hinge pedal kit for this car, so it won't interfere, fortunately. The reason I spec'd a floor hinge pedal kit and not a top hinge pedal kit is because when you are sat low in a car, it's a more natural motion for your ankle than a top hinge pedal kit, which may sometimes require you to lift your heel up when braking and things like that. So I can keep my heels on the ground, and I've got much better control of the car. Great news. And because the steering rack is now down there, rather than the column being here, it's now up and out of the way, so that I can actually left foot brake and stuff like that. That's beautiful. But all of that means that this bush is just out the way. Only just. I didn't know whether this would work. These arms were the only arms I could get hold of at the moment in France. And I bought them anyway, even though it's only one side, because I wanted to prove to myself that it would work. Because you can look at measurements all day online, but until you have them in your hand, and until you can make a mock-up like this, you don't actually know whether it'll work or not. And fortunately, it's absolutely perfect, which is fantastic. The other good news is that because the MX-5 front uprights are from a front-engine rear-wheel drive car, they aren't designed to have a CV joint attached to them, which means that they don't have to orbit round a CV joint like the Minis do, meaning that they have a different arc that they turn around, which means that my footwell can actually be a slightly better size, so I actually have more room for my pedals than I would have with an original Cox GTM. It's millimetres, but every millimetre adds up. If you can get some millimetres here, you can get some millimetres there, it all adds up to centimetres, and that means that a very tall man fits in a very small car. I've got a camping kit mat in here to use as a temporary seat, but once I get in, I know that's not how you get in a racing car, but the floor is very thin currently. I do fit, which is great, there's about that much headroom. Unfortunately, there's no seat in it. So, yeah. Now you may be asking yourself, what about the relationship between the rear suspension and the front suspension? Because the rear suspension is from a Honda crossover and the front suspension is from a Mazda sports car, and the two were never designed to meet. However, the good news is that you can fit 13-inch wheels on an MX-5 front, even with the standard MX-5 brakes. So that's great news. We know that we can fit 13-inch wheels on the front of our GTM, because I really didn't want to fit massive wheels. The other thing is, one of the defining characteristics of suspension that you can't change is the distance between the two ball joints, which gives you your roll centre. Now, you may notice that we have a really big distance here and quite a small distance here. And that's really good news, because if you look on Formula Fords and things like that, even modern Formula 1 cars, you'll notice that the rear uprights are really tall and the front uprights are much, much smaller, because you want a different roll centre at the front than you do at the rear. And when we add in our ball joints and all of that, the good news is that our roll centre is still beneficial for us, even though these are quite small. When we add our ball joints, we still have more than enough height that these are substantially bigger. The really good thing is that we have an engine that is in front of the rear axle line, we have a fuel tank that is behind the rear axle line, and we have front and rear a proper double wishbone setup that can be made fully adjustable. And it's really difficult to do the maths with measurements that you get off some forum somewhere. But now I have both suspension units in the workshop, I can really start doing the working out of how the front suspension and rear suspension will work together. We can work out mounting points and all that stuff. So that's the really good news. Now that I actually have physical things to work with, we can start designing the front and designing the rear, because you can kind of design it, but until you have the thing in front of you and you know that nothing's going to catch and you know how it's going to work, you can really start to nail down those fine millimetric details. Because there's no instruction book for building a car like this. You know, nobody's ever done this before, and that's what makes it really interesting. But at the same time, you've just got to do it the right way. And like I said, there was no point me building a whole rear subframe and a whole front subframe until I had the suspension here and I could really work out the best way to do it. Because this is not a show car. This is a proper Grand Touring Mini. And on that note, we are currently underweight, you'll be glad to know. So even with all this integrated roll cage, as strong as it is and as stiff as it is far lighter than the original floor pan that we have over there, which is crashed and knackered and there's big bits chopped out of it. This is far, far lighter. So we are on track to build a car that is underweight, which means I can then add sound deadening and stuff like that in, while not making a car that is heavier than a Cox GTM should be. So hopefully this car with its big tyres and its big engine and its excellent suspension and all of that will still weigh the same as a standard Cox GTN. Fingers crossed. So I'm really excited about it. I come in here and it's just the best thing in the world. Please tell me what you think down in the comments below. There are days when I'm trying to do research and I'm struggling to get parts, and especially with the current health crisis and all of that. I know it's not the biggest thing in the world, but to me, trying to build this, trying to make all videos for you guys, it has posed some challenges. And when things get tough and when I feel frustrated, I go into my videos and I read the comment section, because I have one of the nicest comment sections on the internet. You lot are so supportive and so lovely, so thank you all for being so mega. Yeah, some of you ask the funniest questions, but also everybody's polite to each other, everybody's considered, everybody's so lovely, and thank you for that. It means so much to me to have a really, really nice community. I could not ask for more, so thank you all for being so lovely. And if you'd like to support this channel, the best way you can do that is by subscribing, clicking like, and then going to tell your friends. Go on Piston Heads, go on your favourite forum, go on Reddit, whatever you want to do, wherever you get your fix of car stuff when you're not watching these videos, go there and tell them to come and watch these videos. We were recently, this is really good news, we were recently featured in an article on Jalopnik, which is one of the websites, well, it's like the biggest car news website on the internet. And Brad Brownell, who is a long-time viewer of this channel, but he's also one of the main writers over there at Jalopnik, he included us as one of the car builds to watch on YouTube, as one like the car builds to watch on YouTube, and we were featured alongside some really big companies who are like big media companies and have massive sponsorships and stuff like that. And to say it's just, you know, little old me working away in a cold garage in France, that means the world to me, you know. there are people with, you know, workshops that are worth more than my house, and we're managing to stay with them, and that's amazing. And a lot of that is down to your support, so thank you all for being so awesome and supporting this channel. Please be awesome to each other, and I'll see you all in the next video. Bye bye.